Hi there, Bungie. Hey there, Solo. Alright, have a good day, you two. So, hey there, Varinda. How are you all doing? Yes, it is. It is just so damn hot today again. I don't know what is it that so often when I decide to stream, it is so hot. It is very hot today. It must be me. That's my conclusion. Very simple mel is needed. Alright. So let's... Oh no, he already has enough. Meow. Brr, brr. It's okay, I forgive you guys. So long as you don't forget that I'm a panther, I don't mind anymore. It's going to be easier. Have a good night. Good rest. So let's begin. We stopped it where we had just gone to the South Pole and put a flag there to claim it as the first people going into the South Pole. And onwards into chapter 15, Accident or Incident. The next day, the 22nd of March, at 6 in the morning, preparations for departure were begun. Alright, thank you, Solon. The last gleams of twilight were melting into night. The cold was great. The constellations shone with wonderful intensity. In the zenith glittered that wondrous Southern Cross, the polar bear of Antarctic regions. The thermometer showed 12 degrees below zero, and when the wind freshened, it was most biting. Flakes of ice increased on the open water. The sea seemed everywhere alike. Numerous blackfish patches spread on the surface, showing the formation of fresh ice. Evidently, the southern basin, frozen during the 6 winter months, was absolutely inaccessible. What became of the whales in that time? Doubtless, they went beneath the icebergs, seeking more practicable seas. As to the seals and morses accustomed to live in a hard climate, they remained on these icy shores. These creatures have the instinct to break holes in the ice fields and to keep them open. To these holes they come for breath. When the birds, driven away by the cold, have emigrated to the north, these sea mammals remain sole masters of the polar continent. But the reservoirs were filling with water, and the Nautilus was slowly descending. At 1,000 feet deep it stopped. It grew at a speed of 15 miles an hour. Towards night it was already floating under the immense body of the iceberg. At 3 in the morning I was awakened by a violent shock. I sat upon my bed and listened in the darkness, when I was thrown in the middle of the room. The Nautilus, after having struck, had rebounded violently. I groped along the partition and by the staircase to the saloon, which was lit by the luminous ceiling. The furniture was upset. Fortunately, the windows were firmly set and had held fast. The pictures on the starboard side, from being no longer vertical, were clinging to the paper, whilst those on the port side were hanging at least a foot from the wall. The Nautilus was lying on its starboard side, perfectly motionless. I heard footsteps and a confusion of voices, but Captain Nemo did not appear. As I was leaving the saloon, Ned Land and Conseil entered. "What is the matter?" said I, at once. "I came to ask you, sir," replied Conseil. "Confound it!" exclaimed the Canadian. "I know well enough. The Nautilus has struck, and judging by the way she lies, I do not think she will right herself as she did the first time in Torres Straits." "But," I asked, "has she at least come to the surface of the sea?" "We do not know," said the consul. "It is easy to decide," I answered. I consulted the manometer. To my great surprise, it showed a depth of more than 180 fathoms. "What does that mean?" I exclaimed. "We must ask Captain Nemo," said Conseil. "But where shall we find him?" said Ned Land. "Follow me," said I to my companions. We left the saloon. There was no one in the library. At the central staircase, by the berths of the ship's crew, there was no one. I thought that Captain Nemo must be in the pilot's cage. It was best to wait. We all returned to the saloon. For 20 minutes we remained thus, trying to hear the slightest noise, which might be made on board the Nautilus when Captain Nemo entered. He seemed not to see us. His face, generally so impassive, showed signs of uneasiness. He watched the compass silently, then the manometer, and going to the planisphere, placed his finger on a spot representing the southern seas. I would not interrupt him, but some minutes later, when he turned towards me, I said, using one of his own expressions in the Torres Straits, "An incident, Captain?" "No, sir. An accident this time." "Serious?" "Perhaps." "Is the danger immediate?" "No." "The Nautilus has stranded?" "Yes." "And this has happened? How?" "From a caprice of nature, not from the ignorance of man. Not a mistake has been made in the working, but we cannot prevent equilibrium from producing its effects. We may brave human laws, but we cannot resist natural ones." Captain Nemo had chosen a strange moment for uttering in this philosophical reflection. On the whole, his answer helped me a little. "May I ask, sir, the cause of this accident?" "An enormous block of ice, a whole mountain, has turned over," he replied. "When icebergs are undermined at their base by warmer water or reiterated shocks, their center of gravity rises and the whole thing turns over. This is what has happened. One of these blocks, as it fell, struck the Nautilus. Then, gliding under its hull, raised it with irresistible force, bringing it into beds which are not so thick where it is lying on its side." "But can we not get the Nautilus off by emptying its reservoirs, that it may regain its equilibrium?" "That, sir, is being done at this moment. You can hear the pump working. Look at the needle of the manometer. It shows that the Nautilus is rising, but the block of ice is rising with it, and until some obstacle stopped its ascending motion, our position cannot be altered. Indeed, the Nautilus still held the same position to the starboard. Doubtless it would right itself when the block stopped. But at this moment, who knows if may not be frightfully crushed between two glassy surfaces? I reflected on all the consequences of our position. Captain Nemo never took his eyes off the manometer. Since the fall of the iceberg, the Nautilus had risen about 150 feet, but it still made the same angle with the perpendicular. Suddenly, a slight movement was felt in the hold. Evidently, it was righting a little. Things hanging in the saloon were sensibly returning to their normal position. The partitions were nearing the upright. No one spoke. With beating hearts we watched and felt the straightening. The boards became horizontal under our feet. 10 minutes passed. "At last we have righted!" I exclaimed. "Yes," said Captain Nemo, going to the door of the saloon. "But are we floating?" I asked. "Certainly," we replied, "since the reservoirs are not empty, and, when empty, the Nautilus must rise to the surface of the sea." We were in the open sea, but a distance of about 10 yards. On either side of the Nautilus rose a dazzling wall of ice, above and beneath the same wall. Above, because the lower surface of the iceberg stretched over us like an immense ceiling. Just 1 second. Let me take care of the cat. Okay, back. Always so whiny. I must have had a very harsh life. And he was alone? Okay, so continuing. We were in the open sea, but a distance of about 10 yards on either side of the Nautilus rose a dazzling wall of ice, above and beneath the same wall. Above, because the lower surface of the iceberg stretched over us like an immense ceiling. Beneath, because the overturned block, having slid by degrees, had found a resting place on the lateral walls, which kept it in that position. The Nautilus was really imprisoned in a perfect tunnel of ice more than 20 yards in breadth, filled with quiet water. It was easy to get out of it by going either forward or backward, and then make a free passage under the iceberg, some hundreds of yards deeper. The luminous ceiling had been extinguished, but the saloon was still resplendent with intense light. It was the powerful reflection from the glass partition sent violently back to the sheets of the lantern. I cannot describe the effect of the voltaic rays upon the great blocks so capriciously cut. Upon every angle, every ridge, every facet was thrown a different light, according to the nature of the veins running through the ice. A dazzling mine of gems, particularly of sapphires, their blue rays crossing with the green of the emerald. Here and there were opal shades of wonderful softness, running through bright spots like diamonds of fire, the brilliancy of which the eye could not bear. The power of the lantern seemed increased 100-fold, like a lamp through the lenticular plates of a first-class lighthouse. "How beautiful! How beautiful!" cried Council. "Yes," I said, "it is a wonderful sight, is it not, Ned?" "Yes, confound it, yes," answered Ned Land. "It is superb. I am mad at being obliged to admit it. No one has ever seen anything like it, but the sight may cost us dear. And if I must say all, I think we are seeing here things which God never intended men to see. Ned was right. It was too beautiful. Suddenly, a cry from Council made me turn. "What is it?" I asked. "Shut your eyes, sir! Do not look, sir!" Saying which, Council clapped his hands over his eyes. "But what is the matter, my boy?" "I am dazzled, blinded." My eyes turned involuntarily towards the glass, but I could not stand the fire which seemed to devour them. I understood what had happened. Nautilus had put on full speed. All the quiet luster of the ice walls was at once changed into flashes of lightning. The fire from these myriads of diamonds was blinding. It required some time to calm our troubled looks. At last the hands were taken down. "Faith, I should never have believed it," said Council. It was then 5 in the morning, and at that moment a shock was felt at the bows of the Nautilus. I knew that its spur had struck a block of ice. It must have been a false maneuver, for the submarine tunnel, obstructed by blocks, was not very easy navigation. I thought that Captain Nemo, by changing his course, would turn these obstacles, or else follow the windings of the tunnel. In any case, the road before us could not be entirely blocked, but, contrary to my expectations, the Nautilus took a decided retrograde motion. "We are going backwards?" said Council. "Yes," I replied. "This end of the tunnel I can have no regrets." "And then?" "Then," said I, "the working is easy. We must go back again, and go out at the southern opening. That is all." In speaking thus, I wished to appear more confident than I really was, but the retrograde motion of the Nautilus was increasing, and, reversing the screw, it carried us at great speed. "It will be a hindrance," said Ned. "What does it matter? Some hours or more or less, provided we get out at last." "Yes," repeated Ned Land, "provided we do get out at last." For a short time I walked from the saloon to the library. My companions were silent. I soon threw myself on an ottoman and took a book, which my eyes overran mechanically. A quarter of an hour later, Council, approaching me, said, "Is what you are reading very interesting, sir?" "Very interesting," I replied. "I should think so, sir. It is your own book you are reading." "My book?" And indeed I was holding in my hand the work on The Great Submarine Depths. I did not even dream of it. I closed the book and returned to my walk. Ned and Council rose to go. "Stay here, my friends," said I, detaining them. "Let us remain together until we are out of this block." As you please, sir, Conseil replied. Some hours passed. I often looked at the instruments hanging from the partition. The manometer showed that the Nautilus kept at a constant depth of more than 300 yards. The compass still pointed to the south. The log indicated a speed of 20 miles an hour, which, in such a cramped space, was very great. But Captain Nemo knew that he could not hasten too much, and that minutes were worth ages to us. At 25 minutes past 8, a second shock took place, this time from behind. I turned pale. My companions were close by my side. I seized Conseil's hand. Our looks expressed our feelings better than words. At this moment, the captain entered the saloon. I went up to him. Our course is beared southward? I asked. Yes, sir. The iceberg has shifted and closed every outlet. You are blocked up, then? Yes. Oh, that seems a very problematic situation. Chapter 16. Want of Air. Thus, around the Nautilus, above and below, was an impenetrable wall of ice. We were prisoners to the iceberg. I watched the captain. His countenance had resumed its habitual imperturbability. Gentlemen, said he, calmly, there are two ways of dying in the circumstances which we are placed. This inexplicable person had the air of a mathematical professor lecturing to his pupils. The first is to be crushed. The second is to die of suffocation. I do not speak of the possibility of dying of hunger, for the supply of provisions in the Nautilus will certainly last longer than we shall. Let us then calculate our chances. As to suffocation, Captain, I replied, that is not to be feared, because our reservoirs are full. Just so, but they will only yield 2 days' supply of air. Now, for 36 hours we have been hidden under the water, and already the heavy atmosphere of the Nautilus requires renewal. In 48 hours our reserve will be exhausted. Well, Captain, can we be delivered before 48 hours? You will attempt it, at least, by piercing the wall that surrounds us. On which side? Sound will tell us. I am going to run the Nautilus aground on the lower bank, and my men will attack the iceberg on the side that is least thick. A sensible decision. Captain Nemo went out. Soon I discovered by a hissing noise that the water was entering the reservoirs. The Nautilus sank slowly and rested on the ice at a depth of 350 yards, the depth at which the lower bank was immersed. My friends, I said, our situation is serious, but I rely on your courage and energy. Sir, replied the Canadian, I am ready to do anything for the general safety. Good. Ned, and I held my hand to the Canadian. I will add, he continued, that being as handy with the pickaxe as with the harpoon, if I can be useful to the captain, he can command my services. He will not refuse your help. Come, Ned. I led him to the room where the crew of the Nautilus were putting on their cork jackets. I told the captain of the Ned's proposal, which he accepted. The Canadian put on his sea costume and was ready as soon as his companions. When Ned Land was dressed, I re-entered the drawing room, where the panes of glass were open, and, posted near Conseil, I examined the ambient beds that supported the Nautilus. Some instants after, we saw a dozen of the crew sat on foot on the bank of ice, and among them Ned Land, easily known by his stature. Captain Nemo was with them. Before proceeding to dig the walls, he took the soundings to be sure of working in the right direction. Long sounding lines were sunk in the side walls, but after 15 yards they were again stopped by the thick wall. It was useless to attack it on the ceiling-like surface, since the iceberg itself measured more than 400 yards in height. Captain Nemo then sounded the lower surface. There, 10 yards of wall separated us from the water. So great was the thickness of the ice field. It was necessary, therefore, to cut it from a piece equal in extent to the waterline of the Nautilus. Yeah, hey there, Solikam, how are you doing? Great, that's good. Our fellow adventurers are stuck in the ice. Captain Nemo then sounded the lower surface. There, 10 yards of wall separated us from the water. So great was the thickness of the ice field. It was necessary, therefore, to cut it from a piece equal in extent to the waterline of the Nautilus. There were about 6,000 cubic yards to detach, so as to dig a hole by which we could descend to the ice field. The work was begun immediately and carried on with indefatigable energy. Instead of digging round the Nautilus, which would have involved greater difficulty, Captain Nemo had an immense trench made at 8 yards from the port quarter. Then the men set to work simultaneously with the screws. They just went to sleep, I see. Hope it helps you to sleep then. Then the men set to work simultaneously with the screws on several points of its circumference. Presently the pickaxe attacked this compact matter vigorously, and large blocks were detached from the mass. By a curious effect of specific gravity, these blocks, lighter than water, fled, so to speak, to the vault of the tunnel, that increased in thickness at the top in proportion as it diminished at the base. But that mattered little, so long as the lower part grew thinner. After 2 hours' hard work, Ned Land came in, exhausted. He and his comrades were replaced by new workers, whom Conseil and I joined. The second lieutenant of the Nautilus superintended us. The water seemed singularly cold, but they soon got warm handling the pickaxe. My movements were free enough, although they were made under pressure of 30 atmospheres. When I re-entered, after working 2 hours, to take some food and rest, I found a perceptible difference between the pure fluid with which the Royal Coil engine supplied me and the atmosphere of the Nautilus, already charged with carbonic acid. The air had not been renewed for 48 hours, and its vivifying qualities were considerably enfeebled. However, after a lapse of 12 hours, we had only raised a block of ice 1 yard thick on the market surface, which was about 6,000 cubic yards. Reckoning that it took 12 hours to accomplish this much, it would take 5 nights and 4 days to bring this enterprise to a satisfactory conclusion. 5 nights and 4 days, and we have only air enough for 2 days in the reservoirs. Without taking into account, said Ned, that even if we get out of this infernal prison, we shall also be imprisoned under the iceberg, shut out from all possible communication with the atmosphere. True enough, who could then foresee the minimum of time necessary for our deliverance? We might be suffocated before the Nautilus could regain the surface of the waves. Was it destined to perish in this ice tomb, with all those it enclosed? The situation was terrible, but everyone had looked the danger in the face, and each was determined to do his duty to the last. As I expected, during the night a new block of a yard square was carried away, and still further sank the immense hollow. But in the morning, when, dressed in my cork jacket, I traversed this slushy mass at a temperature of 6 or 7 degrees below zero, I remarked that the side walls were gradually closing in. The beds of water farthest from the trench, that were not warmed by the men's mere work, showed a tendency to solidification. In presence of this new and imminent danger, what would become of our chances of safety, and how hinder the solidification of this liquid medium that would burst the partitions of the Nautilus like glass? I did not tell my companions of this new danger. What was the good of dampening the energy they displayed in the painful work of escape? But when I went on board again, I told Captain Nemo of this grave complication. "I know it," he said, in that calm tone which could counteract the most terrible apprehensions. "It is one danger more, but I see no way of escaping it. The only chance of safety is to go quicker than solidification. We must be beforehand with it, that is all." On this day, for several hours, I used my pickaxe vigorously. The work kept me up. Besides, to work was to quit the Nautilus and to breathe directly the pure air drawn from the reservoirs and supplied by our apparatus, and to quit the impoverished and vitiated atmosphere. Towards evening, the trench was dug 1 yard deeper. When I returned on board, I was nearly suffocated by the carbonic acid which the earth was filled. If we had only the chemical means to drive away this deleterious gas. We had plenty of oxygen. All this water contained a considerable quantity, and by dissolving it with our powerful piles, it would restore the vivifying fluid. I had thought well over it, but of what good was that, since the carbonic acid produced by our respiration had invaded every part of the vessel? To absorb it, it was necessary to fill some jars with caustic potash, and to shake them incessantly. Now the substance was wanting on board, and nothing could replace it. On that evening, Captain Nemo ought to open the taps of his reservoirs, and let some pure air into the interior of the Nautilus. Without this precaution, we could not get rid of the sense of suffocation. Next day, March 26th, I resumed my miner's work in beginning the 5th yard. The side walls and the lower surface of the iceberg thickened visibly. It was evident that they would meet before the Nautilus was able to disengage itself. Despair seized me for an instant. My pickaxe nearly fell from my hands. What was the good of digging if I must be suffocated, crushed by the water that was turning into stone? A punishment that the ferocity of the savages even would not have invented. Just then, Captain Nemo passed near me. I touched his hand and showed him the walls of our prison. The wall to port had advanced to at least 4 yards from the hull of the Nautilus. The captain understood me and signed me to follow him. We went on board. I took off my cork jacket and accompanied him into the drawing room. Mr. Aronnax, we must attempt some desperate means, or we shall be scalded up in this solidified water as in cement. Yes, but what is to be done? If my Nautilus were strong enough to bear this pressure without being crushed. Well, I asked, not catching the captain's idea. Do you not understand, we replied, that this congelation of water will help us? Do you not see that, by its solidification, it will burst through this field of ice that imprisons us? When it freezes, it bursts the hardest stones. Do you not perceive that it would be an agent of safety instead of destruction? Yes, Captain, perhaps, but whatever resistance to crushing the Nautilus possesses, it could not support this terrible pressure and would be flattened like an iron plate. I know it, sir. Therefore, we must reckon on the aid of nature, but on our own exertions. I must stop the solidification. Not only will the side walls be pressed together, but there is not 10 feet of water before or behind the Nautilus. The congelation gains on us on all sides. How long will the air in the reservoirs last for us to breathe on board? The captain looked in my face. After tomorrow they will be empty. A cold sweat came over me. However, ought I to have been astonished at the answer? On March 22nd, the Nautilus was in the open polar seas. We were at 26th. For 5 days we had lived in the reserve on board, and what was left of the respirable air must be kept for the workers. Even now, as I write, my recollection is still so vivid that an involuntary terror seizes me, and my lungs seem to be without air. Meanwhile, Captain Nemo reflected silently, and evidently an idea had struck him, but he seemed to reject it. At last, these words escaped his lips. "Boiling water," he muttered. "Boiling water?" I cried. "Yes, sir. We are enclosed in a space that is relatively confined. Would not jets of boiling water, constantly injected by the pumps, raise the temperature in this part and stay in the congelation?" "Let us try it," I said resolutely. "Let us try, Professor." The thermometer then stood at 7 degrees outside. Captain Nemo took me to the galleys, where the vast distillatory machine stood that furnished the drinkable water by evaporation. They filled these with water, and all the electrical heat from the piles was thrown through the worms baited in the liquid. In a few minutes, this water reached 100 degrees. It was directed towards the pumps, while fresh water replaced it in proportion. The heat developed by the troughs was such that cold water, drawn up from the sea, after only having gone through the machines, came boiling at the body of the pump. The injection was begun, and 3 hours after the thermometer marked 6 degrees below zero outside. 1 degree was gained. 2 hours later, the thermometer only marked 4 degrees. "We shall succeed," I said to the captain, after having anxiously watched the result of the operation. "I think," he answered, "that we shall not be crushed. We have no more suffocation to fear." During the night, the temperature of the water rose to 1 degree below zero. The injections could not carry it to a higher point, but as the congelation of the seawater produces at least 2 degrees, I was at last reassured against these dangers of solidification. The next day, March 27th, 6 yards of ice had been cleared, 4 yards only remaining to be cleared away. There was yet 48 hours' work. The air could not be renewed in the interior of the Nautilus, and this day would make it worse. An intolerable weight oppressed me. Toward 3 o'clock in the evening, this feeling rose to a violent degree. Yawns dislocated my jaws. My lungs panted as they inhaled this burning fluid, which became rarefied more and more. A moral torpor took hold of me. I was powerless, almost unconscious. My brave consul, though exhibiting the same symptoms and suffering the same manner, never left me. He took my hand and encouraged me, and I heard him murmur, "Oh, if only I could only not breathe, so as to leave more air for my master." Tears came into my eyes on hearing him speak thus. If our situation to all was intolerable in the interior, with what haste and gladness would we put on our cork jackets to work in our turn? Pickaxe sounded on the frozen ice beds. Our arms ached, the skin was torn off our hands. But what were these fatigues? What did the wounds matter? Vital air came to the lungs. We breathed. All this time, no one prolonged his voluntary task beyond the prescribed time. His task accomplished, each one handed in turn to his panting companions the apparatus that supplied him with life. Captain Nemo set the example and submitted first to his severe discipline. When the time came, he gave up his apparatus to another and returned to the vitiated air on board, calm, unflinching, unmurmuring. On that day, the ordinary work was accomplished with unusual vigor. Only 2 yards remained to be raised from the surface. 2 yards only separated us from the open sea, but the reservoirs were nearly emptied of air. The little that remained ought to be kept for the workers, not a particle for the Nautilus. When I went back on board, I was half suffocated. What a night! I know not how to describe it. The next day, my breathing was oppressed. Dizziness accompanied the pain in my head and made me like a drunken man. My companions showed the same symptoms. Some of the crew had rattling in the throat. On that day, the 6th of our imprisonment, Captain Nemo, finding the pickaxes worked too slowly, resolved to crush the ice bed that still separated us from the liquid sheet. This man's coolness and energy never forsook him. He subdued his physical pains by moral force. By his orders, the vessel was lightened, that is to say, raised from the ice bed by a change of specific gravity. When it floated, they towed it so as to bring it above the immense trench made on the level of the water line. Then, filling his reservoirs of water, he descended and shut himself up in the hole. Just then, all the crew came on board, and the double door of communication was shut. The Nautilus then rested on the bed of ice, which was not 1 yard thick, and which the sounding leads had perforated in 1,000 places. The taps of the reservoir were then opened, and 100 cubic yards of water let in, increasing the weight of the Nautilus 1,800 tons. We waited, we listened, forgetting our sufferings in hope. Our safety depended on this last chance. Notwithstanding the buzzing in my head, I soon heard the humming sound under the hull of the Nautilus. The ice had cracked with a singular noise, like tearing paper, and the Nautilus sank. "We are off!" murmured Conseil in my ear. I could not answer him. I seized his hand and pressed it convulsively. All at once, carried away by its frightful overcharge, the Nautilus sank like a bullet under the waters. That is to say, it fell as if it were in a vacuum. Then all the electric force was put on the pumps that soon began to let water out of the reservoirs. After some minutes, our fall was stopped. Soon, too, the maneuver indicated an ascending movement. The screw, going at full speed, made the iron hull tremble to its very bolts and drew us towards the north. But if this floating under the iceberg is to last another day before we reach the open sea, I shall be dead first. Half stretched upon a divan in the library, I was suffocating. My face was purple, my lips blue, my faculties suspended. I neither saw nor heard. All notion of time had gone from my mind. My muscles could not contract. I do not know how many hours passed thus, but I was conscious of the agony that was coming over me. I felt as if I was going to die. Suddenly I came to. Some breaths of air penetrated my lungs. Had we risen to the surface of the waves? Were we free of the iceberg? No. Ned and Conseil, my two brave friends, were sacrificing themselves to save me. Some particles of air still remained at the bottom of one apparatus. Instead of using it, they had kept it for me. And while they were being suffocated, they gave me life, drop by drop. I wanted to push back the thing. They held my hands, and for some moments I breathed freely. I looked at the clock. It was 11 in the morning. It ought to be the 28th of March. The Nautilus went at a frightful pace, 40 miles an hour. It literally tore through the water. Where was Captain Nemo? Had he succumbed? Were his companions dead with him? At the moment, the manometer indicated that we were not more than 20 feet from the surface. A mere plate of ice separated us from the atmosphere. Could we not break it? Perhaps. In any case, the Nautilus was going to attempt it. I felt that it was in an oblique position, lowering the stern and raising the bows. The introduction of water had been the means of disturbing its equilibrium. Then, impelled by its powerful screw, it attacked the ice field from beneath like a formidable battering ram. It broke it by backing and then rushing forward against the field, which gradually gave way. And at last, dashing suddenly against it, shot forward in the icy field, that crushed beneath its weight. The panel was opened, one might say torn off, and the pure air came in abundance to all parts of the Nautilus. Chapter 17. From Cape Horn to the Amazon. Free at last. That must have been very nerve-wracking to everyone. How I got onto the platform, I have no idea. Perhaps the Canadian had carried me there, but I breathed and inhaled the vivifying sea air. My two companions were getting drunk with the fresh particles. The other unhappy men had been so long without food that they could not with impunity indulge in the simplest elements that were given them. We, on the contrary, had no need to restrain ourselves. We could draw this air freely into our lungs, and it was the breeze alone that filled us with this keen enjoyment. "Ah," said Consul, "how delightful this oxygen is! Master need not fear to breathe it. There is enough for everybody." Ned Land did not speak, but he opened his jaws wide enough to frighten a shark. Our strength soon returned, and when I looked around me, I saw we were alone on the platform. The foreign seamen of the Nautilus were contented with the air that circulated in the interior. None of them had come to drink in the open air. The first words I spoke were words of gratitude and thankfulness to my two companions. Ned and Consul had prolonged my life during the last hours of this long agony. All my gratitude could not repay such devotion. "My friends," said I, "we are bound one to the other forever, and I am under infinite obligations to you." "Which I shall take advantage of," exclaimed the Canadian. "What do you mean?" said Consul. "I mean that I shall take you with me when I leave this infernal Nautilus." "Well," said Consul, "after all this, are we going right?" "Yes," I replied, "for we are going the way of the sun, and here the sun is in the north." "No doubt," said Ned Land, "but it remains to be seen whether he will bring the ship into the Pacific or the Atlantic Ocean, that is, into frequented or deserted seas." I could not answer that question, and I feared that Captain Nemo would rather take us to the vast ocean that touches the coast of Asia and America at the same time. He would thus complete the tour round the submarine world, and return to those waters in which the Nautilus could sail freely. We ought, before long, to settle this important point. The Nautilus went at a rapid pace. The polar circle was soon passed, and the course shaped for Cape Horn. We were off, the American Point, March 31st, at 7 o'clock in the evening. Then all our past sufferings were forgotten. The remembrance of that imprisonment in the ice was effaced from our minds. We only thought of the future. Captain Nemo did not appear again, either in the drawing room or on the platform. The point shown each day on the planisphere and marked by the lieutenant showed me the exact direction of the Nautilus. Now, on that evening, it was evident, to my great satisfaction, that we were going back to the north of the Atlantic. The next day, April 1st, when the Nautilus ascended to the surface, some minutes before noon, we sighted land to the west. It was Terra del Fuego, which the first navigators named thus from seeing the quantity of smoke that rose from the natives' huts. The coast seemed low to me, but in the distance rose high mountains. I even thought I had a glimpse of Mount Sarmiento that rises 20,070 yards above the level of the sea, with a very pointed summit, which, according as it is misty or clear, is a sign of fine or wet weather. At this moment, the peak was clearly defined against the sky. Rosny, did you hear something about Arya? I don't see her. Yeah, she has been dealing with some issues, so she's trying to rest more. She's not going to stream for a while until she's better. I think she's still going to play Kingdom with me next week, or this week, since Sunday is the first week. Just I believe the Unicorn Princess is starting soon, or so I was told by Lumina. The Nautilus, diving again under the water, approached the coast, which was only some few miles off. From the glass windows in the drawing room, I saw long seaweeds and gigantic fuci, and varech, of which the open polar sea contained so many specimens, with their sharp, polished filaments. They measured about 300 yards in length, real cables, thicker than one stump, and having great tenacity. They are often used as ropes for vessels. Another weed, known as velp, with leaves 4 feet long, buried in the coral concretions, hung at the bottom. It served as nest and food for myriads of crustacea and mollusks, crabs and cuttlefish. There, seals and others had splendid repasts, eating the flesh of fish with sea vegetables, according to the English fashion. Over this fertile and luxuriant ground, the Nautilus passed with great rapidity. Towards evening, it approached the Falkland Group, the rough summits of which I recognized the following day. The depth of the sea was moderate. On the shores, our nets brought in beautiful specimens of seaweed, and particularly a certain fucus, the roots of which were filled with the best mussels in the world. Geese and ducks fell by dozens in the platform and soon took their places in the pantry on board. With regard to fish, I observed especially specimens of the goby species, some 2 feet long, all over white and yellow spots. I admired also numerous medusae, and the finest of the sort, the chrysaora, peculiar to the sea about the Falkland Islands. I should have liked to preserve some specimens of these delicate zoophytes, but they are only like clouds, shadows, apparitions that sink and evaporate when out of their native element. When the last heights of the Falklands had disappeared in the horizon, the Nautilus sank to between 20 and 25 yards and followed the American coast. Captain Nemo did not show himself. Until the 3rd of April we did not quit the shores of Patagonia, sometimes under the ocean, sometimes at the surface. The Nautilus passed beyond the large estuary formed by the mouth of the Plata, and was, on the 4th of April, 56 miles off Uruguay. Its direction was northwards, and followed the long windings of the coast of South America. It had then made 1,600 miles since our embarkation in the seas of Japan. About 11 o'clock in the morning, the tropic Capricorn was crossed in the 37th meridian, and we passed Cape Frio, standing out to sea. Captain Nemo, to Ned Land's great displeasure, did not like the neighborhood of the inhabited coasts of Brazil, for we went at a giddy speed. Not a fish, not a bird of the swiftest kind could follow us, and the natural curiosities of these seas escaped all observation. This speed was kept up for several days, and in the evening of the 9th of April we sighted the most westerly point of South America that forms Cape San Roque. But then the Nautilus swerved again. Swerved again and sought the lowest depth of the submarine valley, which is between this cape and Sierra Leone on the African coast. This valley bifurcates to the parallel of the Antilles, and terminates at the north by the enormous depression of 9,000 yards. In this place, the geological basin of the ocean forms, as far as the Lesser Antilles, a cliff of 3.5 miles perpendicular in height, and at the parallel of the Cape Verde Islands, another wall not less considerable, that encloses thus all the sunk continent of the Atlantic. The bottom of this immense valley is dotted with some mountains that give to these submarine places a picturesque aspect. I speak, moreover, from the manuscript charts that were in the library of the Nautilus. Charts evidently due to Captain Nemo's hand and made after his personal observations. For 2 days the desert and deep waters were visited by means of the inclined planes. The Nautilus was furnished with long diagonal broadsides which carried it to all elevations. But on the 11th of April it rose suddenly. The land appeared at the north of the Amazon River, a vast estuary, the embouchure of which is so considerable that it freshens the sea water for the distance of several leagues. The equator was crossed. 20 miles to the west were the Guianas, a French territory on which we could have found an easy refuge. But a stiff breeze was blowing, and the furious waves would not have allowed a single boat to face them. Ned Land understood that, no doubt, for he spoke not a word about it. For my part, I made no allusion to his schemes of flight, for I would not urge him to make an attempt that must inevitably fail. I made the time to pass pleasantly by interesting studies. During the days of April 11th and 12th, the Nautilus did not leave the surface of the sea, and the net brought in a marvelous haul of zoophytes, fish, and reptiles. Some zoophytes had been fished up by the chain of the nets. They were, for the most part, beautiful phytacilines, belonging to the Acnidian family, and among other species the Phytalis protexta, peculiar to that part of the ocean, with a little cylindrical trunk, ornamented with vertical lines, speckled with red dots, crowning a marvelous blossoming of tentacles. Hey there, turquoise hexagon! Welcome! Hope you enjoy your time here. Hi there, Noram! Howdy, how are you? Continuing. As to the mollusks, they consisted of some I had already observed, Turritellus, Oliviporphyras, with regular lines intercrossed, with red spots standing out plainly against the flesh, odd pteroceras, like petrified scorpions, translucid hyalias, argonauts, cuttlefish, excellent eating, and certain species of calmars that naturalists of antiquity have classed amongst the flying fish, and that serve principally for bait and for cod fishing. I had now an opportunity of studying several species of fish on these shores. Amongst the cartilaginous ones, Petromyzion sprica, a sort of eel, 15 inches long, with a greenish head, violet fins, grey-blue back, brown belly, silvered and sewn with bright spots. The pupil of the eye encircled with a gold, a curious animal that the current of the Amazon had drawn to the sea, for they inhabit fresh waters, tuberculated streaks with pointed snouts and a long loose tail armed with a long jagged sting. Little sharks, a yard long, grey and whitish skin, and several rows of teeth, bent back that are generally known by the name of pantophos, vespertilius, a kind of red isosceles triangle, half a yard long, to which pectorals are attached by fleshy prolongations that make them look like bats, but that their horny appendage, situated near the nostrils, has given them the name of sea unicorns. Lastly, some species of Ballistae, the Curasavian, whose spots were of a brilliant gold color, and the capricus of clear violet, and which with varying shades, like a pigeon's throat. I end here this catalogue, which is somewhat dry perhaps, but very exact, with a series of bony fish that I observed in passing belonging to the apteronauts, and whose snout is white as snow, the body of a beautiful black, marked with a very long, loose, fleshy strip. Odognathates armed with spikes, sardines, 9 inches long, glittering with a bright silver light. A species of mackerel provided with 2 anal fins, centronodes of a blackish tint that are fished for with torches. Long fish 2 yards in length with fat flesh, white and firm, which, when they are fresh, taste like eel, and when dry, like smoked salmon. Labras, half red, covered with scales only at the bottom of the dorsal and anal fins. Chrysooptera, on which gold and silver blend their brightness with that of the ruby and topaz. Golden-tailed spares, the flesh of which is extremely delicate, and whose phosphorescent properties betray them in the midst of the waters. Orange-colored spares with long tongues, migres with gold caudal fins, dark torn tails, anaplebs of Suriname, etc. Notwithstanding this, etc., I must not omit to mention fish that Conseil will long remember, and with good reason. One of our nets had hauled up a sort of very flat ray fish, which, with the tail cut off, formed a perfect disc, and weighed 20 ounces. It was white underneath, red above, with large round spots of dark blue encircled with black, very glossy skin, terminating in a bilobed fin. Laid out on the platform, it struggled, tried to turn itself by convulsive movements, and made so many efforts that one last turn had nearly sent it to the sea. But Conseil, not wishing to let the fish go, rushed to it, and, before I could prevent him, had seized it with both hands. In a moment he was overthrown, his legs in the air, and half his body paralyzed, crying, "Oh, master, master, come to me!" It was the first time the poor boy had not spoken to me in the third person. The Canadian and I took him up and rubbed his contracted arms till he became sensible. The unfortunate Conseil had attacked a crampfish of the most dangerous kind, a cumama. This odd animal, in a medium conductor like water, strikes fish at several yards distance. So great is the power of this electric organ, the 2 principal surfaces of which do not measure less than 27 square feet. The next day, April 12th, the Nautilus approached the Dutch coast. Near the mouth of the Maroni, there several groups of sea cows herded together. They were manatees that, like the dugong and the stellara, belong to the Sirenian order. These beautiful animals, peaceable and inoffensive, from 18 to to 21 feet in length, weighed at least 1,600 weight. I told Ned Land and Conseil that provident nature had assigned an important role to this mammalia. Indeed, they, like the seals, are designed to graze on the submarine prairies and thus destroy the accumulation of weed that obstructs the tropical rivers. And do you know, I added, what has been the result since men have almost entirely annihilated this useful race? That the petrified weeds have poisoned the air, and the poisoned air causes the yellow fever that desolates these beautiful countries. Enormous vegetations are multiplied under the torrid seas, and the evil is irresistibly developed from the mouth of the Rio de la Plata to Florida. If we are to believe Toussenel, this plague is nothing to what it would be if the seas were cleared of whales and seals. Then, infested with pulps, medusae, and cuttlefish, they would become immense centers of infection, since the waves would not possess these vast stomachs that God had charged to infest the surface of the seas. However, without disputing these theories, the crew of the Nautilus took possession of half a dozen manatees. They provisioned the larders with excellent flesh, superior to beef and veal. This sport was not interesting. The manatees allowed themselves to be hit without defending themselves. Several thousand pounds of meat were stored up on board to be dried. On this day, a successful haul of fish increased the stores of the Nautilus. So full of game were the seas, they were echinades belonging to the third family of the Malacopterygians. Their flattened discs were composed of transverse, movable cartilaginous plates, by which the animal was enabled to create a vacuum, and so to adhere to any object, like a cupping glass. The remora that I had observed in the Mediterranean belongs to this species, but the one of which we are speaking was the Echinades osteochera, peculiar to this sea. The fishing over, the Nautilus neared on the coast. About here, a number of sea turtles were sleeping on the surface of the water. It would have been difficult to capture these precious reptiles, for the least noise awakens them, and their solid shell is proof against the harpoon, but the Echinades effects their capture with extraordinary precision and certainty. This animal is, indeed, a living fishhook, which would make the fortune of an inexperienced fisherman. The crew of the Nautilus tied a ring to the tail of this fish, so large as not to encumber their movements, and to this ring a long cord lashed to the ship's side by the other end. The Echinades, thrown into the sea, directly began their game, and fixed themselves to the breastplate of the turtles. The tenacity was such that they were torn rather than let go of their hold. The men hauled them on board, and with them the turtles to which they adhered. They took also several cacoaners a yard long, which weighed 400 pounds. Their carapace covered with a large horny plates, thin, transparent, brown and white and yellow spots. Fetch a good price in the market. Besides, they were excellent in an edible point of view, as well as the fresh turtles, which have an exquisite flavor. This day's fishing brought to a close our stay in the shores of the Amazon, and by nightfall the Nautilus had regained the high seas. Chapter 18. The Pulps. Let me drink a little tea. For several days, the Nautilus kept off from the American coast. Evidently, it did not wish to risk the tides of the Gulf of Mexico or the Sea of the Antilles. April 16th, we sighted Martinique and Guadeloupe from a distance of 30 miles. I saw their tall peaks for an instant. The Canadian, who counted on carrying out his projects in the Gulf by either landing or hailing one of their numerous boats that coast from one island to another, was quite disheartened. Flight would have been quite practicable if Ned Land had been able to take possession of the boat without the captain's knowledge, but in the open sea it could not be thought of. The Canadian, Consul, and I had a long conversation on the subject. For 6 months we had been prisoners on board the Nautilus. We had travelled 70,000 leagues, and, as Ned Land said, there was no reason why it should not come to an end. We could hope nothing from the captain of the Nautilus, but only from ourselves. Besides, for some time past he had become graver, more retired, less sociable. He seemed to shun me. I met him hardly. Formerly he was pleased to explain the submarine marvels to me. Now he left me to my studies and came no more to the saloon. What change had come over him? For what cause? For my part, I did not wish to bury with me my curious novel studies. I had now the power to write the true book of the sea, and this book, sooner or later, I wished to see daylight. Then again, in the water by the Antilles, 10 yards below the surface of the waters, by the open panels, what interesting products I had to enter on my daily notes. There were, among other zoophytes, those known under the name of Physalis pelagica, a sort of large oblong bladder with mother-of-pearl rays holding out their membranes to the wind and letting their blue tentacles float like threads of silk. Charming medusae to the eye, real nettles to the touch, that is still a corrosive fluid. There were also annelids, a yard and a half long, furnished with a pink horn and with 1,700 locomotive organs that win through the waters and throw out in passing all of the light of the solar spectrum. There were, in the fish category, some Malabar Rays, enormous grisly things 10 feet long, weighing 600 pounds, the pectoral fin triangular in the midst of a slightly humped back, the eyes fixed in the extremities of the face, beyond the head, and which floated like weft, and looked sometimes like an opaque shutter of a glass's window. There were American ballistae, which nature has only dressed in black and white, gobies with yellow fins and prominent jaw, mackerel 16 feet long, with short pointed teeth, covered with small scales, belonging to the albicolor species. Then, in swarms, appeared grey mullet, covered with stripes of gold from the head to the tail, beating the resplendent fins like masterpieces. Like masterpieces of jewelry, consecrated formally to Diana, particularly sought after by rich Romans, and of which the proverb says, Whoever takes them does not eat them. Lastly, pomancate dories, ornamented with emerald hands, dressed in velvet and silk, passed before our eyes like Veronese lords, spurred sperry, passed with their pectoral fins, cuplanodons 15 inches long. Enveloped, those descriptions are so lengthy. Sorry, just a moment. Okay. Continuing. Oh, it's almost over. I hope there's not too many more of those. These are really boring to read. Clopinodrons 15 inches long, enveloped by their phosphorescent light. Mullet beat the sea with their large, jagged tails. Red vandaces seemed to maul the waves with their showy pectoral fins, and silvery selenies, worthy of their name, rose in the horizon of the waters like so many moons with whitish rays. April 20th, we had risen to a mean height of 1,500 yards. The land nearest to us then was the archipelago of the Bahamas. There rose high submarine cliffs covered with large weeds, giant laminaria and fuci, a perfect espalier of hydrophytes worthy of a Titan word. It was about 11 o'clock when Ned Land drew my attention to a formidable prickling, like the sting of an ant, which was produced by means of large seaweeds. Well, he said, these are proper caverns for poops, and I should not be astonished to see some of these monsters. What? Said Consul. Cuttlefish? Real cuttlefish? Of the cephalopod class? No, I said, poops of huge dimensions. I will never believe that such animals exist, said Ned. Well, said the Consul, with the most serious air in the world, I remember perfectly to have seen a large vessel drawn under the waves by a cephalopod's arm. You saw that? Said the Canadian. Yes, Ned, with your own eyes. With my own eyes. Where, pray, that might be? At St. Malo, answered Consul. In the port? Said Ned, ironically. No, in a church, replied Consul. In a church, cried the Canadian. Yes, friend Ned, in a picture representing the poop in question. "Good," said Ned Land, bursting out laughing. "He is quite right," I said. "I have heard of this picture, but the subject represented is taken from a legend, and you know what to think of legends in the matter of natural history. Besides, when it is a question of monsters, the imagination is apt to run wild. Not only it is supposed that these poops can drown down vessels, but a certain Olaus Magnus speaks of a cephalopod a mile long that is more like an island than an animal. It is also said that the Bishop of Nidrus was building an altar on an immense rock. Mass finished, the rock began to walk and returned to the sea. The rock was a poop. Another bishop, Pontoppidan, speaks also of a poop on which a regiment of cavalry could maneuver. Lastly, the ancient naturalists speak of monsters whose mouths were like goofs, and which were too large to pass through the Straits of Gibraltar. "But how much is true of these stories?" asked Consul. "Nothing, my friends, at least of that which passes the limit of truth to get to fable or legend. Nevertheless, there must be some ground for the imagination of the storytellers. One cannot deny that poops and cuttlefish exist of a large species, inferior, however, to the cetaceans. Aristotle has stated the dimensions of a cuttlefish as 5 cubits, or 9 feet 2 inches. Our fishermen frequently see some that are more than 4 feet long. Some skeletons of poops are preserved in the museums of Trieste and Montpellier that measure 2 yards in length. Besides, according to the calculations of some naturalists, one of these animals, only 6 feet long, could have tentacles 27 feet long. That would suffice to make a formidable monster." "Do they fish for them in these days?" asked Ned. "If they do not fish for them, sailors see them at least. One of my friends, Captain Paul Boss of Havre, has often affirmed that he met one of these monsters of colossal dimensions in the Indian seas. But the most astonishing fact, and which does not permit of the denial of the existence of these gigantic animals, happened some years ago, in 1861. "What is the fact?" asked Ned Land. "This is it. In 1861, to the northeast of Tenerife, very nearly in the same latitude as we are in now, the crew of the dispatch boat Alector perceived a monstrous cuttlefish swimming in the waters. Captain Borger went near to the animal and attacked it with harpoons and guns, without much success, for balls and harpoons glided over the soft flesh. After several fruitless attempts, the crew tried to pass a slip knot around the body of the mollusk. The noose slipped as far as the caudal fins, and there stopped. They tried then to haul it on board, but its weight was so considerable that the tightness of the cord separated the tail from the body, and, deprived of this ornament, he disappeared under the water." "Indeed, is that a fact?" "An indisputable fact, my good Ned. They proposed to name this poop Borger's cuttlefish." "What length was it?" asked the Canadian. "Did it not measure about 6 yards?" said Consul, who, posted at the window, was examining again the irregular windings of the cliff. "Precisely," I replied. Its head, rejoined Council, was it not crowned with 8 tentacles that beat the water like a nest of serpents? Precisely. Yes, Council. Had not its eyes placed at the back of its head considerable development? Yes. And was not its mouth like a parrot's beak? Exactly, Council. Very well. No offense to master, he replied quietly. If this is not Burger's cuttlefish, it is at least one of its brothers. I looked at Council. Ned hurried to the window. What a horrible beast! He cried. I looked in my turn and could not repress a gesture of disgust. Before my eyes was a horrible monster, worthy to figure in the legends of the marvelous. It was an immense cuttlefish, being 8 yards long. It swam crossways in the direction of the Nautilus with great speed, watching us with its enormous staring green eyes. Its 8 arms, or rather feet, fixed to its head, that have given the name of cephalopod to these animals, were twice as long as its body, and were twisted like the Fury's hair. One could see the 250 air holes on the inner side of the tentacles. Bye, Nora. Have a great day. And thanks for passing by. The monster's mouth, a horned beak like a parrot's, opened and shut vertically. Its tongue, a horned substance, furnished with several rows of pointed teeth, came out, quivering from this veritable pair of shears. What a freak of nature! A bird's beak on a mollusk? Its spindle-like body formed a fleshy mass that might weigh 4,000 or 5,000 pounds. The varying color changing with great rapidity according to the irritation of the animal. Passed successfully from livid grey to reddish brown. What irritated this mollusk? No doubt the presence of the Nautilus, more formidable than itself, and on which its suckers or its jaws had no hold. Yet, what monsters these pulps are! What vitality the Creator has given them! What vigor in their movements! And they possess 3 hearts! Chance had brought this in presence of the cuttlefish, and I did not wish to lose the opportunity to carefully study this specimen of cephalopods. I overcame the horror that inspired me, and, taking a pencil, began to draw it. Perhaps this is the same which a lector saw, said Consul. No, replied the Canadian, for this is whole, and the other had lost its tail. That is no reason, I replied. The arms and tails of these animals are reformed by head integration, and in 7 years the tail of Bulgar's cuttlefish has no doubt had time to grow. By this time the other pulps appeared at the portlight. I counted 7. They formed a procession after the Nautilus, and I heard their beaks gnashing against the iron hull. I continued my work. These monsters kept in the waters with such precision that they seemed immovable. Suddenly, the Nautilus stopped. A shock made it tremble in every plate. Have we struck anything? I asked. In any case, replied the Canadian, we shall be free, for we are floating. The Nautilus was floating, no doubt, but it did not move. A minute passed. Captain Nemo, followed by his lieutenant, entered the drawing room. I had not seen him for some time. He seemed dull. Without noticing or speaking to us, he went to the panel, looked at the poops, and said something to his lieutenant. The latter went out. Soon the panels were shut. The sailing was lighted. I went towards the captain. A curious collection of poops? I said. Yes, indeed, Mr. Naturalist, he replied, and we are going to fight them, man to beast. I looked at him. I thought I had not heard right. Man to beast? I repeated. Yes, sir, the screw is stopped. I think that the horny jaws of one of the cuttlefish is entangled in the blades. That is what prevents our moving. What are you going to do? Rise to the surface and slaughter this vermin. A difficult enterprise. Yes, indeed. And electric bullets are powerless against the soft flesh, where they do not find resistance enough to go off. But we shall attack them with the ratchet. And the harpoon, sir? Said the Canadian, if you do not refuse my help. I will accept it, Master Land. We will follow you, I said, and following Captain Nemo, we went towards the central staircase. There, about 10 men with boarding hatchets were ready for the attack. Conseil and I took 2 hatchets. Ned Land seized a harpoon. The Nautilus had then risen to the surface. One of the sailors, posted on the top of the ladder step, unscrewed the bolts of the panels, but hardly were the screws loosened when the panel rose with great violence, evidently drawn by the suckers of a poop's arm. Immediately, one of the arms slid like a serpent down the opening, and 20 others were above. With one blow of the axe, Captain Nemo cut this formidable tentacle that slid wriggling down the ladder. Just as we were pressing one on the other to reach the platform, 2 other arms, lashing the air, came down on the seaman placed before Captain Nemo, and lifted him up with irresistible power. Captain Nemo uttered a cry and rushed out. We hurried after him. What a scene! The unhappy man, seized by the tentacle and fixed to the suckers, was balanced in the air at the caprice of this enormous trunk. He howled in his throat, he was stifled, and he cried, "Help! Help!" These words, spoken in French, startled me. I had fellow countrymen on board, perhaps several. That heart-rending cry, I shall hear it in all my life. The unfortunate man was lost. Who could rescue him from that powerful pressure? However, Captain Nemo had hushed to the poop, and with one blow of the axe had cut through one arm. His lieutenant struggled furiously against the other monsters that crept on the flanks of the Nautilus. The crew fought with their axes. The Canadian, Conseil, and I buried our weapons into the fleshy masses. A strong smell of musk penetrated the atmosphere. It was horrible. For one instant, I thought the unhappy man, entangled with the pulp, would be torn from its powerful suction. 7 of the 8 arms had been cut off, only one wriggled in the air, brandishing the victim like a feather. But just as Captain Nemo and his lieutenant threw themselves on it, the animal ejected a stream of black liquid. We were blinded with it. When the cloud dispersed, the cuttlefish had disappeared, and my unfortunate countryman with it. 10 or 12 pulps now invaded the platform and sides of the Nautilus. We rolled pell-mell into the midst of this nest of serpents that wriggled on the platform in the waves of blood and ink. It seemed as though these slimy tentacles sprang up like the Hydra's heads. Ned Land's harpoon, at each stroke, was plunged into the strong eyes of the cuttlefish, but my bold companion was suddenly overturned by the tentacles of a monster he had not been able to avoid. Ah, how my heart beat with emotion and horror! The formidable beak of a cuttlefish was open over Ned Land. The unhappy man would be cut in two. I rushed to his succor, but Captain Nemo was before me. His axe disappeared between the two enormous jaws, and miraculously saved, the Canadian, rising, plunged his harpoon deep into the triple heart of the poop. "I owed myself this revenge," said the captain to the Canadian. Ned bowed without replying. The combat had lasted a quarter of an hour. The monsters, vanquished and mutilated, left us at last and disappeared under the waves. Captain Nemo, covered with blood, nearly exhausted, gazed upon the sea that had swallowed up one of his companions, and great tears gathered in his eyes. Chapter 19. The Goof Stream. I will be right back. I will get something to drink and a little something to eat. I'll be back in some 5 minutes or so. Mac. I'm starting to get a little dizzy. Oh, the top. Continuing then. On chapter 19, the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream again, isn't it? I think he had already gone over the Gulf Stream before. This terrible scene of the 20th of April, none of us can ever forget. I have written it under the influence of violent emotion. Since then, I have revised the recital. I have read it to Consul and to the Canadian. They found it exact as to facts, but insufficient as to effect. To paint such pictures, one must have the pen of the most illustrious of our poets, the author of The Toilers of the Deep. I have said that Captain Nemo wept while watching the waves. His grief was great. It was the second companion he had lost since our arrival on board, and what a death! That friend, crushed, stifled, bruised by the dreadful arms of a poop, pounded by his iron jaws, would not rest with his comrades in the peaceful coral cemetery. In the midst of the struggle, it was the despairing cry uttered by the unfortunate man that had torn my heart. The poor Frenchman, forgetting his conventional language, had taken to his own mother tongue to utter a last appeal. Amongst the crew of the Nautilus, associated with the body and soul of the captain, recoiling like him from all contact with men, I had a fellow countryman. Did he alone represent France in this mysterious association, evidently composed of individuals of various nationalities? It was one of those insoluble problems that rose up unceasingly before my mind. Captain Nemo entered his room, and I saw him no more for some time. But that he was sad and irresolute I could see by the vessel of which he was the soul, and which received all his impressions. The Nautilus did not keep in its settled course. It floated about like a corpse at the will of the waves. It went at random. He could not tear himself away from the scene of the last struggle, from the sea that had devoured one of his men. 10 days passed thus. It was not till the 1st of May that the Nautilus resumed its northerly course, after having sighted the Bahamas at the mouth of the Bahama Channel. We were then following the current from the largest river to the sea, that has its banks, its fish, and its proper temperatures. I mean the Gulf Stream. It is really a river that flows freely in the middle of the Atlantic, and whose waters do not mix with the ocean waters. It is a salt river, salter than the surrounding sea. Its mean depth is 1,500 fathoms, its mean breadth 10 miles, In certain places, the current flows with the speed of 2.5 miles an hour. The body of its waters is more considerable than that of all the rivers in the globe. It was on this ocean river that the Nautilus then sailed. This current carried with it all kinds of living things. Argonauts, so common in the Mediterranean, were there in quantities. Of the grisly sort, the most remarkable were the turbot, whose slender tails form nearly the third part of the body, and that looked like large lozenges, 25 feet long. Also sharks. Sharks a yard long, with large heads, short rounded muzzles, pointed teeth in several rows, and whose bodies seemed covered with scales. I will skip this part a little bit because those descriptions are just very tiring now. So I'll skip a little this part. Just talking about all the colorful fish, he's saying, as usual. Yes, boring. I must add that, during the night, the phosphorescent waters of the Goof stream rivaled the electric power of our watchlight, especially in the stormy weather that threatened us so frequently. May 8th, we were still crossing Cape Hatteras, at the height of North Carolina. The width of the Goof stream there is 75 miles, and its depth 210 yards. The Nautilus still went at random, all supervision seeming abundant. I thought that, under these circumstances, escape would be possible. Indeed, the inhabited shores offered anywhere an easy refuge. The sea was incessantly plotted by the steamers that ply between New York or Boston and the Gulf of Mexico, and overrun day and night by the little schooners coasting about the several parts of the American coast. We could hope to be picked up. It was favorable opportunity, notwithstanding the 30 miles that separated the Nautilus from the coasts of the Union. One unfortunate circumstance thwarted the Canadians' plans. The weather was very bad. We were nearing those shores where tempests are so frequent, that country of water sprouts and cyclones actually endangered by the current of destruction. Ned Land owned this himself. He fretted, seized with nostalgia that flight only could cure. "Master," he said that day to me, "this must come to an end. I must make a clean breast of it. This Nemo is leaving land and going up to the north, but I declare to you, I have had enough of the South Pole, and I will not follow him to the north." "What is to be done, Ned, since flight is impracticable just now?" "You must speak to the captain," said he. "You said nothing when we were in your native seas. I will speak, now we are in mine. When I think that before long the Nautilus will be by Nova Scotia, and that there, near Newfoundland, is a large bay, and into that bay the St. Lawrence empties itself, and that the St. Lawrence is my river, the river by Quebec, my native town. When I think of this, I feel furious. It makes my hair stand on end. Sir, I would rather throw myself into the sea. I will not stay here. I am stifled." The Canadian was evidently losing all patience. His vigorous nature could not stand this prolonged imprisonment. His face altered daily, his temper became more surly. I knew what he must suffer, for I was seized with nostalgia myself. Nearly 7 months had passed without our having had any news from land. Captain Nemo's isolation, his altered spirits, especially since the fight with the poops, his taciturnity, all made me view things in a different light. "Well, sir?" said Ned, seeing I did not reply. "Well, Ned, do you wish me to ask Captain Nemo his intentions concerning us?" "Yes, sir." "Although he has already made them known?" "Yes, I wish it settled, finally. Speak for me, in my name only, if you like." "They so seldom meet him, he avoids me." "This is all the more reason for you to go see him." I went to my room. From thence I meant to go to Captain Nemo's. It would not do to let this opportunity of meeting him slip. I knocked at the door. No answer. I knocked again. Then turned the handle. The door opened. I went in. The captain was there. Bending over his work table, he had not heard me. Resolved not to go without having spoken, I approached him. He raised his head quickly, frowned, and said huffily, "You here? What do you want?" "To speak to you, Captain." "But I am busy, sir. I am working. I leave you at liberty to shut yourself up. Cannot I be allowed the same?" This reception was not encouraging, but I was determined to hear and answer everything. "Sir," said I, coldly, "I have to speak to you on a matter that admits of no delay." "What is that, sir?" he replied, ironically. "Have you discovered something that has escaped me, or has the sea delivered up any new secrets?" We were at cross purposes, but before I could reply, he showed me an open manuscript on his table and said, in a more serious tone, "Here, Mr. Aronnax, is a manuscript written in several languages. It contains the sum of my studies on the sea, and, if it please God, it shall not perish with me. This manuscript, signed with my name, completed with the history of my life, will be shut up in a little insubmersible case. The last survivor of all of us on board the Nautilus will throw this case into the sea, and it will go whither it is borne by the waves." This man's name, his history, written by himself, his mystery would then be revealed some day. "Captain," I said, "I can but approve of the idea that makes you act thus. The result of your studies must not be lost, but the means you employ seem to me primitive. Who knows where the winds will carry this case, and in whose hands it will fall? Could you not use some other means? Could not you, or one of yours—" "Never, sir," he said, hastily interrupting me. "But I and my companions are ready to keep this manuscript in store, and if you will put us at liberty—" "At liberty?" said the captain, rising. "Yes, sir. That is the subject on which I wish to question you. For 7 months we have been here on board, and I ask you today, in the name of my companions, and in my own, if your intention is to keep us here, always." "Mr. Aronnax, I will answer you today as I did 7 months ago. Whoever enters the Nautilus must never quit it. You impose actual slavery on us. Give it what name you please. But everywhere the slave has the right to regain his liberty. Who denies you this right? Have I ever tried to chain you with an oath? He looked at me with his arms crossed. Sir, I said, to return a second time to this subject will be neither to your nor my taste, but as we have entered upon it, let us go through with it. I repeat, it is not only myself whom it concerns. Study is to me a relief, a diversion, a passion that could make me forget everything. Like you, I am willing to live obscure, in the frail hope of bequeathing one day to future time the result of my labors. But it is otherwise with Ned Land. Every man worthy of the name deserves some consideration. Have you thought that love of liberty, hatred of slavery, can give rise to schemes of revenge in a nature like the Canadians? That he could think, attempt, and try? I was silent, said. Captain Nemo rose. Whatever Ned Land thinks of, attempts, or tries, what does it matter to me? I did not seek him. It is not for my pleasure that I keep him on board. As for you, Mr. Aronnax, you are one of those who can understand everything, even silence. I have nothing more to say to you. Let this first time you have come to treat of this subject be the last. For a second time, I will not listen to you. I retired. Our situation was critical. I related my conversation to my two companions. We know now, said Ned, that we can expect nothing from this man. The Nautilus is nearing Long Island. We will escape, whatever the weather may be. I'll be right back really quickly. Okay, I'm back. But the sky became more and more threatening. Symptoms of a hurricane became manifest. The atmosphere was becoming white and misty. On the horizon, fine streaks of cirrus clouds were succeeded by masses of cumuli. Other low clouds passed swiftly by. The swollen sea rose in huge billows. The birds disappeared, with the exception of the petrels, those friends of the storm. The barometer fell sensibly and indicated an extreme tension of the vapors. The mixture of the storm glass was decomposed under the influence of the electricity that pervaded the atmosphere. The tempest burst on the 18th of May, just as the Nautilus was floating off Long Island, some miles from the port of New York. I can describe this strife of the elements, for, instead of fleeing to the depths of the sea, Captain Nemo, by an unaccountable caprice, would brave it at the surface. The wind blew from the southwest at first. Captain Nemo, during the squalls, had taken his place on the platform. He made himself fast to prevent being washed overboard by the monstrous waves. I had hoisted myself up and made myself fast also, dividing my admiration between the tempest and this extraordinary man who was coping with it. The raging sea was swept by huge cloud drifts, which were actually saturated with the waves. The Nautilus, sometimes lying on its side, sometimes standing up like a mast, rolled and pitched terribly. About 5 o'clock a torrent of rain fell that lulled neither sea nor wind. The hurricane blew nearly 40 leagues an hour. It is under these conditions that it overturns houses, breaks iron gates, displaces 24-pounders. However, the Nautilus, in the midst of the tempest, confirmed the words of a clever engineer. There is no well-constructed hull that cannot defy the sea. This was not a resisting rock, it was a steel spindle, obedient and movable, without rigging or masts, that braved its fury with impunity. However, I watched these raging waves attentively. They measured 15 feet in height and 150 to 175 yards long, and their speed of propagation was 30 feet per second. Their bulk and power increased with the depth of the water. Such waves as these, at the Hebrides, have displaced a mass of 8,500 pounds. They are they which, in the tempest of December 23rd, 1864, after destroying the town of Yedo in Japan, broke the same day on the shores of America. The intensity of the tempest increased with the night. The barometer, as in 1860 at the reunion during the cyclone, fell 7/10 at the close of day. I saw a large vessel pass the horizon, struggling painfully. She was trying to lie under the half steam to keep up above the waves. Yes, so very annoying. I wish I had something I could do to this cat. But nope. Let me close the door. Just 1 second. It's like he's all the time saying, "Hey, I finally see someone. Meow, 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 give me something. I don't know what he wants." No matter what I give him, he continues meowing. There is nothing I can do. I must be horrified of his time strolling in the forest alone. That's my only conclusion. So here we continue. Five mana points, yeah. If only it worked that way. It was probably one of the steamers of the line from New York to Liverpool or Havre. It soon disappeared in the gloom. At 10 o'clock in the evening, the sky was on fire. The atmosphere was streaked with vivid lightning. I could not bear the brightness of it, while the captain, looking at it, seemed to envy the spirit of the tempest. A terrible noise filled the air, a complex noise made up of the howls of the crushed waves, the roaring of the wind, and the claps of thunder. The wind veered suddenly to all points of the horizon, and the cyclone, rising in the east, returned after passing by the north, west, and south, in the inverse course pursued by the circular storms of the southern hemisphere. Ah, that Goof stream! It deserves its name of the king of tempests. It is that which causes those formidable cyclones by the difference of temperature between its air and its currents. A shower of fire had succeeded the rain. The drops of water were changed to sharp spikes. One would have thought that Captain Nemo was courting a death worthy of himself, a death by lightning, as the Nautilus, pitching dreadfully, raised its steel spur with the air. It seemed to act as a conductor, and I saw long sparks burst from it. Crushed and without strength, I crawled to the panel, opened it, and descended to the saloon. The storm was then at its height. It was impossible to stand upright in the interior of the Nautilus. Captain Nemo came down about 12. I heard the reservoirs filling by degrees, and the Nautilus sank slowly beneath the waves. Through the open windows in the saloon, I saw large fish, terrified, passing like phantoms in the water. Some were struck before my eyes. The Nautilus was still descending. I thought that about 8 fathoms deep we should find a calm, but no. The upper beds were too violently agitated for that. We had to seek repose at more than 25 fathoms in the bowels of the deep. But there, what quiet, what silence, what peace. Who could have told that such a hurricane had been let loose on the surface of the ocean? Chapter 20. From latitude 47.24 to longitude 47 degrees 28. In consequence of the storm, we had been thrown eastward once more. All hope of escape on the shores of New York or the St. Lawrence had faded away, and poor Ned, in despair, had isolated himself like Captain Nemo. Conseil and I, however, never left each other. I said that the Nautilus had gone aside to the east. I should have said, to be more exact, the northeast. For some days it wandered first on the surface and then beneath it, amid those fogs so dreaded by sailors. What accidents are due to those thick fogs? What shocks upon these reefs when the wind drowns the breaking of the waves? Of collisions between vessels, in spite of their warning lights, whistles, and alarm bells, and the bottoms of the seas look like a field of battle, where still lie all the conquered of the ocean, some old and already encrusted, others fresh and reflecting from their iron bands and copper plates the brilliancy of our lantern. On the 15th of May, we were at the extreme south of the Bank of Newfoundland. This bank consists of alluvia, or large heaps of organic matter, brought either by the equator by the Gulf Stream or from the North Pole by the counter-current of cold water which skirts the American coast. There also are heaped up those erratic blocks which are carried along by the broken ice, and close by a vast channel house of mollusks and zoophytes which perish here by millions. The depth of the sea is not great at Newfoundland, not more than some hundreds of fathoms, but toward the south is a depression of 1,500 fathoms. There, the Gulf Stream widens. It loses some of its speed and some of its temperature, but it becomes a sea. It was on the 17th of May, about 500 miles from Heart's Content, at a depth of more than 1,400 fathoms, that I saw the electric cable lying on the bottom. Conseil, to whom I had not mentioned it, thought at first that it was a gigantic sea serpent, but I undeceived the worthy fellow, and by way of consolation related several particulars in the laying of this cable. The first one was laid in the years 1857 and 1858, but after transmitting about 500 telegrams, would not act any longer. In 1863, the engineers constructed another one measuring 2,000 miles in length and weighing 4,500 tons, which was embarked on the Great Eastern. This attempt also failed. On the 25th of May, the Nautilus, being at a depth of more than 1,980 fathoms, was in the precise spot where the rupture occurred which ruined the Enterprise. It was within 638 miles of the coast of Ireland, and at 2:30 in the afternoon they discovered that communication with Europe had ceased. The electricians on board resolved to cut the cable before fishing it up, and at 11 o'clock at night they had recovered the damaged part. They made another point and spliced it, and it was once more submerged. But some days after it broke again, and in the depths of the ocean could not be recaptured. The Americans, however, were not discouraged. Cyrus Field, the bold promoter of the enterprise, as he had sunk all his own fortune, set a new subscription on foot, which was at once answered, and another cable was constructed on better principles. The bundles of conducting wires were each enveloped in gutta percha and protected by a wadding of hemp contained in a metallic covering. The Great Eastern sailed on the 13th of July, 1866. The operation worked well, but one incident occurred. Several times in unrolling the cable, they observed that nails had been recently forced into it, evidently with the motive of destroying it. Captain Anderson, the officers, and engineers consulted together and had it posted up that if the offender was surprised on board, he would be thrown out without further trial into the sea. From that time, the criminal attempt was never repeated. On the 23rd of July, the Great Eastern was not more than 500 miles from Newfoundland when they telegraphed from Ireland news of the armistice concluded between Prussia and Austria after Sadowa. On the 27th, in the midst of the heavy fogs, they reached port of Heart's Content. The enterprise was successfully terminated, and for its first dispatch, young America addressed old Europe in these words of wisdom so rarely understood. Glory to God in the highest, and on earth peace, goodwill towards men. I did not expect to find an electric cable in its primitive state, such as it was on leaving the manufactory. The long serpent, covered with the remains of shells, bristling with foraminiferae, was encrusted with a strong coating which served as a protection against all boring mollusks. It lay quietly sheltered from the motions of the sea, and under a favorable pressure for the transmission of the electric spark which passes from Europe to America in .32 of a second. Doubtless this cable will last for a great length of time, for they will find that gutta percha covering is improved by the sea water. Besides, on this level, so well chosen, the cable is never so deeply submerged as to cause it to break. The Nautilus followed it to the lowest depth, which was more than 2,212 fathoms, and there it lay, without any anchorage, and then we reached the spot where the accident had taken place in 1863. The bottom of the ocean then formed a valley about 100 miles broad, in which Mont Blanc might have been placed without its summit appearing above the waves. This valley, closed at the east by a perpendicular wall more than 2,000 yards high. We arrived there on the 28th of May, and the Nautilus was then not more than 120 miles from Ireland. Was Captain Nemo going to land on the British Isles? No. To my great surprise, he then made for the south, once more coming back towards European seas. In rounding the Emerald Isle, for an instant I caught sight of Cape Clear and the light which guides the thousands of vessels leaving Glasgow or Liverpool. An important question then arose in my mind. Did the Nautilus dare entangle itself in the English Channel? Ned Land, who had reappeared since we had been nearing land, did not cease to question me. How could I answer? Captain Nemo remained invisible, after having shown the Canadian a glimpse of American shores. Was he going to show me the coast of France? But the Nautilus was still going southward. On the 13th of May, it passed in sight of the Land's End, between the extreme point of England and the Scilly Isles, which were left to starboard. If he wished to enter the English Channel, he must go straight to the east. He did not do so. During the whole of the 31st of May, the Nautilus described a series of circles in the water, which greatly interested me. It seemed to be seeking a spot it had some trouble in finding. At noon, Captain Nemo himself came to the work of the ship's log. He spoke no word to me, but seemed gloomier than ever. What could sadden him thus? Was it his proximity to European shores? Had he come some recollections of his abandoned country? If not, what did he feel? Remorse or regret? For a long while this thought haunted my mind, and I had a kind of presentiment that before long chance would betray the captain's secrets. The next day, the 1st of June, the Nautilus continued the same process. It was evidently seeking some particular spot in the ocean. Captain Nemo took the sun altitude as he had done the day before. The sea was beautiful, the sky clear. About 8 miles to the east, a large vessel could be discerned on the horizon, No flag fluttered from its mast, and I could not discover its nationality. Some minutes before the sun passed the meridian, Captain Nemo took his sextant and watched it with great attention. The perfect rest of the water greatly helped the operation. The Nautilus was motionless. It neither rolled nor pitched. I was on the platform when the altitude was taken, and the captain pronounced these words: "It is here." He turned and went below. Had he seen the vessel, which was changing its course and seemed to be nearing us? I could not tell. I returned to the saloon. The panels closed. I heard the hissing of the water in the reservoirs. Nautilus began to sink, following a vertical line, for its crew communication no motion to it. Some minutes later it stopped at a depth of more than 520 fathoms, resting on the ground. The luminous ceiling was darkened. Then the panels were opened, and through the glass I saw the sea, brilliantly illuminating by the rays of our lantern for at least half a mile around us. I looked to the port side and saw nothing but an immensity of quiet waters. But to starboard, on the bottom appeared a large protuberance, which at once attracted my attention. One would have thought it a ruin buried under the coating of white shells, much resembling a covering of snow. Upon examining the mass attentively, I could recognize the ever-thickening form of a vessel bare its masts, which must have sunk. It certainly belonged to past times. This wreck, to be thus encrusted with lime of the water, must already be able to count many years passed at the bottom of the ocean. What was this vessel? Why did the Nautilus visit its tomb? Could it have been aught but a shipwreck which had drowned it under the water? I knew not what to think. Then, near me, in a slow voice, I heard Captain Nemo say, "At one time this ship was called the Marseillaise. It carried 74 guns, and was launched in 1762. In 1768, the 13th of August, commanded by Lapoy-Vertreux, it fought boldly against the Preston. In 1779, on the 4th of July, it was at the taking of Granada with the squadron of Admiral Estaing. In 1781, on the 5th of September, it took part in the Battle of Comte de Grasse in Shakespeare Bay. In 1794, the French Republic changed its name. On the 16th of April, in the same year, it joined the squadron of Villeroy at Brest, being entrusted with the escort of a cargo of corn coming from America, under the command of Admiral Van Stabel. On the 11th and 12th of April of the second year, this squadron fell in with an English vessel. Sir, today is the 13th April, the 1st of June, 1868. It is now 74 years ago, day for day, on this very spot, in latitude 47 degrees 24, longitude 17 degrees 28. That this vessel, after fighting heroically, losing its 3 masts, with the water in its hold and the third of its crew disabled, preferred sinking with its 356 sailors to surrendering, and nailing its colors to the poop, disappeared under the waves to the cry of Long live the Republic!" "The Avenger!" I exclaimed. "Yes, sir, the Avenger." "A good name," muttered the Captain Nemo, crossing his arms. Chapter 21. A Hecatomb. Hecatomb, a great sacrifice of many victims. The way of describing this unlooked-for scene, the history of the patriotic ship, told at first so coldly, and the emotion with which this strange man pronounced the last words, the name of the Avenger, the significance of which could not escape me, all impressed itself deeply on my mind. My eyes did not leave the captain, who, with his hand stretched out to sea, was watching with a glowing eye the glorious wreck. Perhaps I was never to know who he was, from whence he came, or where he was going to, but I saw the man move, and apart from the savant, it was no common misanthropy which had shut Captain Nemo and his companions within the Nautilus, but a hatred, either monstrous or sublime, which time could never weaken. Did this hatred still seek vengeance? The future would soon teach me that. But the Nautilus was rising slowly to the surface of the sea, and the form of the Avenger disappeared by degrees from my sight. Soon a slight rolling told me that they were in the open air. At that moment a dull boom was heard. I looked at the captain. He did not move. "Captain," said I. He did not answer. I left him and mounted the platform. Conseil and the Canadian were already there. "Where did that sound come from?" I asked. "It was a gunshot," replied Ned Land. I looked in the direction of the vessel I had already seen. It was nearing the Nautilus, and we could see that it was putting on steam. It was within 6 miles of us. "What is that ship, Ned?" "By its rigging and the height of its lower masts," said the Canadian, "I bet she is a ship of war. May it reach us and, if necessary, sink this cursed Nautilus." "Friend Ned," replied Conseil, "what harm can it do to the Nautilus? Can it attack beneath the waves? Can it cannonade us at the bottom of the sea?" "Tell me, Ned," said I, "can you recognize what country she belongs to?" The Canadian knitted his eyebrows, dropped his eyelids, and screwed up the corners of his eyes, and for a few moments fixed a piercing look upon the vessel. "No, sir," he replied, "I cannot tell what nation she belongs to, for she has shows no colors, but I can declare she is a man of war, for a long pennant flutters from her mainmast." For a quarter of an hour we watched the ship which was steaming towards us. It could not, however, believe that she could see the Nautilus from that distance, and still less that she could know what the submarine engine was. Soon the Canadian informed me that she was a large armoured two-decker ram. A thick black smoke was pouring from her 2 funnels. Her closely furled sails were stopped at her yards. She hoisted no flag at her mizzen-peak. The distance prevented us from distinguishing the colours of her pennant, which floated like a thin ribbon. She advanced rapidly. If Captain Nemo allowed her to approach, there was a chance of salvation for us. "Sir," said Ned Land, "if that vessel passes within a mile of us, I shall throw myself into the sea, and I should advise you to do the same." I did not reply to the Canadian's suggestion, but continued watching the ship. Whether English, French, American, or Russian, she would be sure to take us in if we could only reach her. Presently, a white smoke burst from the far part of the vessel. Some seconds after, the water, agitated by the fall of a body, splashed at the stern of the Nautilus. And shortly afterwards, a loud explosion struck my ear. "What? They are firing at us!" I exclaimed. "So, please you, sir," said Ned, "they have recognized the unicorn, and they are firing at us." "But," I exclaimed, "surely they can see that there are men in the case?" "It is perhaps because of that," replied Ned Land, looking at me. A whole flood of light burst upon my mind. Doubtless they knew now how to believe the stories of the pretended monster. No doubt, on board the Abraham Lincoln, when the Canadian struck it with the harpoon, Commander Farragut had recognized that the supposed narwhal, a submarine vessel, more dangerous than a supernatural cetacean. Yes, it must have been so, and on every sea they were now seeking this engine of destruction. Terrible indeed. If, as we supposed, Captain Nemo employed the Nautilus in works of vengeance, on the night when we were imprisoned in that cell, in the midst of the Indian Sea, had he not attacked some vessel? The man buried in the coral cemetery, had he not been a victim to the shock caused by the Nautilus? Yes, I repeat it, it must be so. One part of the mysterious existence of Captain Nemo had been unveiled, and if his identity had not been recognized, at least the nations united against him were no longer hunting a chimerical creature, but a man who had vowed a deadly hatred against them. All the formidable past rose before me. Instead of meeting friends on board the approaching ship, we could only expect pitiless enemies. But the shot rattled above us. Some of them struck the sea and ricocheted, losing themselves on the distance. But none touched the Nautilus. The vessel was not more than 3 miles from us. In spite of the serious cannonade, Captain Nemo did not appear on the platform. But if one of the conical projectiles had struck the shell of the Nautilus, it would have been fatal. The Canadian then said, "Sir, we must do all we can to get out of this dilemma. Let us signal them. They will then, perhaps, understand that we are honest folks." Ned Land took his handkerchief to wave in the air, but he had scarcely displayed it when he was struck down by an iron hand and fell in spite of his great strength upon the deck. "Fool!" exclaimed the captain. "Do you wish to be pierced by the spur of the Nautilus before it is hurled at this vessel?" Captain Nemo was terrible to hear. He was still more terrible to see. "All right, Bangy. I'm glad you had fun. Have a great night. Rest well." Thanks for always showing by. Captain Nemo was terrible to hear. He was still more terrible to see. His face was deadly pale, with a spasm at his heart. For an instant it must have ceased to beat. His pupils were fearfully contracted. He did not speak. He roared, with his body thrown forward, he wrung the Canadian's shoulders. Then, leaving him and turning to the ship of war, whose shot was still raining around him, he exclaimed with a powerful voice, "Ah, ship of an accursed nation, you know who I am. I do not want your colors to know you by. Look, and I will show you mine." And on the far part of the platform, Captain Nemo unfurled a black flag similar to the one he had placed at the South Pole. At that moment, a shot struck the shell of the Nautilus obliquely, without piercing it, and, rebounding near the captain, was lost in the sea. He shrugged his shoulders, and addressing me, said shortly, "Go down, you and your companions. Go down." "Sir," I exclaimed, "are you going to attack this vessel?" "Sir, I am going to sink it." "You will not do that?" "I shall do it," he replied coldly, "and I advise you not to judge me, sir. Fate has shown you what you would not have seen. The attack has begun. Go down." "What is this vessel?" "You do not know? Very well, so much the better. Its nationality to you, at least, will be a secret. Go down." Hey there, fuck. We can only but obey. About 15 of the sailors surrounded the captain, looking with an implacable hatred at the vessel nearing them. One could feel that the same desire of vengeance animated every soul. I went down at the moment another projectile struck the Nautilus, and I heard the captain exclaim, "Strike, mad vessel! Shower your useless shot, and then you will not escape the spur of the Nautilus. But it is not here that you shall perish. I will not have your ruins mingle with those of the Avenger." I reached my room. The captain and his second remained on the platform. The screw was set in motion, and the Nautilus, moving with speed, was soon beyond the reach of the ship's guns. But the pursuit continued, and Captain Nemo contented himself with keeping his distance. About 4 in the afternoon, being no longer able to contain my impatience, I went to the central staircase. The panel was open, and I ventured on the platform. The captain was still walking up and down with an agitated step. He was looking at the ship, which was 5 or 6 miles to leeward. He was going around it like a wild beast, and drawing it eastward, he allowed them to pursue. But he did not attack. Perhaps he still hesitated? I wished to mediate once more, but I had scarcely spoken when Captain Nemo imposed silence, saying, "I am the law, and I am the judge. I am the oppressed, and there is the oppressor. Through him I have lost all that I loved, cherished, and venerated: country, wife, children, father, and mother. I saw all perish. All that I hate is there. Say no more." I cast a last look at the man of war, which was sputting on steam, and rejoined Ned and Conseil. "We will fly," I exclaimed. "Good," said Ned. "What is this vessel?" "I do not know, but whatever it is, it will be sunk before night. In any case, it is better to perish with it than to be made accomplices in a retaliation, the justice of which we cannot judge." "That is my opinion too," said Ned Land coolly. "Let us wait for night." Night arrived. Deep silence reigned on board. The compass showed that the Nautilus had not altered its course. It was on the surface, rolling slightly. My companions and I resolved to fly when the vessel should be near enough to either to hear us or to see us, for the moon, which would be full in 2 or 3 days, shone brightly. Once on board the ship, if we could not prevent the blow which threatened it, we would do all that circumstances would allow. Several times I thought the Nautilus was preparing for attack, but Captain Nemo contented himself with allowing his adversary to approach, and then fled once more before it. Part of the night passed without any incident. We watched the opportunity for action. We spoke little, for we were too much moved. Ned Land would have thrown himself into the sea, but I forced him to wait. According to my idea, the Nautilus would attack the ship at her waterline, and then it would not only be possible, but easy to fly. At 3 in the morning, full of uneasiness, I mounted the platform. Captain Nemo had not left it. He was standing at the forepart near his flag, which was a slight breeze displayed above his head. He did not take his eyes from the vessel. The intensity of his look seemed to attract and fascinate and draw it onward more purely than if he had been towing it. The moon was then passing the meridian. Jupiter was rising in the east. Amid this peaceful scene of nature, sky and ocean rivaled each other in tranquility, the sea offering to the orbs of night the finest mirror they could ever have in which to reflect their image. As I thought of the deep calm of these elements, compared with all of those passions brooding imperceptibly within the Nautilus, I shuddered. The vessel was within 2 miles of us. It was ever nearing the phosphorescent light which showed the presence of the Nautilus. I could see its green and headlights and its white vibration quivering through its rigging, showing that the furnaces were heated to the uttermost. Sheaves of sparks and red ashes flew from the funnels, shining in the atmosphere like stars. I remained thus until 6 in the morning, without Captain Nemo noticing me. The ship stood about 1.5 miles from us, and with the first dawn of day, the firing began afresh. The moment could not be far off when, the Nautilus attacking its adversary, my companions and myself should forever leave these men. I was preparing to go down to remind them when the second mounted the platform, accompanied by several sailors. Captain Nemo either did not or would not see them. Some steps were taken which might be called the signal for action. They were very simple. The iron balustrade around the platform was lowered, and the lantern and pilot cages were pushed within the shell until they were flush with the deck. The long surface of the steel cigar no longer offered a single point to check its maneuvers. I returned to the saloon. The Nautilus still floated. Some streaks of light were filtering through the liquid beds. With the undulations of the waves, the windows were brightened by the red streaks of the rising sun, and this dreadful day of the 2nd of June had dawned. At 5 o'clock, the log showed that the speed of the Nautilus was slackening, and I knew that it was allowing them to draw nearer. Besides, the reports were heard more distinctly, and the projectiles, laboring through the ambient water, were extinguished by a strange hissing noise. "My friends," said I, "the moment has come. One grasp of the hand, and may God protect us." Ned Land was resolute, Conseil calm, myself so nervous that I knew not how to contain myself. We all passed into the library, but the moment I pushed the door opening on the central staircase, I heard the upper panel close sharply. The Canadian rushed on to the stairs, but I stopped him. A well-known hissing noise told me that the water was running into the reservoirs, and in a few minutes the Nautilus was some yards beneath the surface of the waves. I understood the maneuver. It was too late to act. The Nautilus did not wish to strike at the impenetrable cuirass, but below the waterline, where the metallic covering no longer protected it. We were again imprisoned, unwilling witnesses of the dreadful drama that was preparing. We had scarcely time to reflect, taking refuge in my room. We looked at each other without speaking. A deep stupor had taken hold of my mind. Thought seemed to stand still. I was in that painful state of expectation preceding a dreadful report. I waited, I listened. Every sense was merged in that of hearing. The speed of the Nautilus was accelerated. It was preparing to rush. The whole ship trembled. Roar! Suddenly, I screamed. I felt the shock, but comparatively light. I felt the penetrating power of the steel spur. I heard rattlings and scrapplings, but the Nautilus, carried along by its propelling power, passed through the mass of the vessel like a needle through a sailcloth. I could stand it no longer. Mad, out of my mind, I rushed from my room into the saloon. Captain Nemo was there, mute, gloomy, implacable. He was looking through the port panel. A large mass cast a shadow on the water, and that it might lose nothing of her agony. The Nautilus was going down into the abyss with her. 10 yards from me I saw the open shell through which the water was rushing with the noise of thunder, then the double line of guns and the netting. The bridge was covered with black agitated shadows. The water was rising. The poor creatures were crowding the ratlines clinging to the masts, struggling under the water. It was a human ant heap overtaken by the sea. Paralyzed, stiffened with anguish, my hair standing on end, with eyes wide open, panting, without breath and without voice. I too was watching. An irresistible attraction glued me to the glass. Suddenly, an explosion took place. The compressed air blew up her decks as if the magazines had caught fire. Then the unfortunate vessel sank more rapidly. Her topmast, laden with victims, now appeared. Then her spars, bending under the weight of men, and last of all, the top of her mainmast. Then the dark mast disappeared, and with it the dead crew, drowned down by the strong eddy. I turned to Captain Nemo. That terrible avenger, a perfect archangel of hatred, was still looking. When all was over, he returned to his room, opened the door, and entered. I followed him with my eyes. On the end wall beneath his heroes, I saw the portrait of a woman still young and two little children. Captain Nemo looked at them for some moments, stretched his arms towards them, and kneeling down, burst into deep sobs. Chapter 22. The last words of Captain Nemo. Maybe they'll finally leave the ship. The panels had closed on this dreadful vision, but light had not returned to the saloon. All was silence and darkness within the Nautilus. At wonderful speed, 100 feet beneath the water, it was leaving this desolate spot. Whither it was going, to the north or south? Where was the man flying to after such dreadful retaliation? I had returned to my room, where Ned and Conseil had remained silent enough. I felt an insurmountable horror for Captain Nemo. Whatever he had suffered at the hands of this man, he had no right to punish thus. He had made me, if not an accomplice, at least a witness of his vengeance. At 11, the electric light reappeared. I passed into the saloon. It was deserted. I consulted the different instruments. The Nautilus was flying northward at the rate of 25 miles an hour. Now on the surface, and now 30 feet below it. On taking the bearings by the chart, I saw that we were passing the mouth of the channel and that our course was hurrying us towards the northern seas at a frightful speed. That night we had crossed 200 leagues of the Atlantic. The shadows fell, and the sea was covered with darkness until the rising of the moon. I went to my room, but could not sleep. Just 1 second. Okay, back. I went to my room, but could not sleep. I was troubled with dreadful nightmares. The horrible scene of destruction was continually before my eyes. From that day, who could tell into what part of the North Atlantic basin the Nautilus would take us? Still, with unaccountable speed, still in the midst of these northern fogs, would it touch the Spitzbergen, or on the shores of Nova Zembla? Should we explore those unknown seas, the White Sea, the Sea of Kara, the Gulf of Obi, the archipelago of Liaro, and the unknown coast of Asia? I could not say. I could no longer judge the time that was passing. The clocks had been stopped on board. It seemed, as in polar countries, that night and day no longer followed the regular course. I felt myself being drawn into that strange region where the foundered imagination of Edgar Poe roamed at will, like the fabulous Gordon Pym, At every moment I expected to see that veiled human figure of larger proportions than those of any inhabitant of the earth, thrown across the cataract which defends my approach of the pole. I estimated, though perhaps I may be mistaken, I estimated this adventurous course of the Nautilus to have lasted 15 or 20 days. There was a cat, right? Ah, yes, I found the cat. He had been roaming for some time in the forest of the island here. He has a lot of scratches, so he's very upset. He meows a lot. I don't know why. Maybe because of all that he went through while he was alone? I haven't given him a name yet. I need to decide on one. And I know not how much longer it might have lasted had it not been for the catastrophe which ended this voyage. Of Captain Nemo I saw nothing whatever now, nor of his second. Not a man of the crew was visible for an instant. The Nautilus was almost incessantly under water. When we came to the surface to renew wear, the panels opened and shut mechanically. There were no more marks on the planisphere. I knew not where we were. And the Canadian, too, his strength and patience at an end, appeared no more. Conseil could not draw a word from him, and fearing that, in a dreadful fit of madness, he might kill himself, watched him with constant devotion. One morning, what date I cannot say, I had fallen into a heavy sleep towards the early hours, a sleep both painful and unhealthy. When I suddenly awoke, Ned Land was leaning over me, saying in a low voice, "We are going to fly." I sat up. "When shall we go?" I asked. "Tomorrow night. All inspection on board the Nautilus seems to have ceased. All appear to be stupefied. You will be ready, sir?" "Yes." "Where are we?" "In sight of land. I took the reckoning this morning in the fog, 20 miles to the east." "What country is it?" "I do not know, but whatever it is, we will take refuge there." "Yes, Ned, yes, we will fly tonight, even if the sea should swallow us up." The sea is bad, the wind violent, but 20 miles in that light boat of the Nautilus does not frighten me. Unknown to the crew, I have been able to procure food and some bottles of water. "I will follow you." "But," continued the Canadian, "if I am surprised, I will defend myself. I will force them to kill me." "We will die together, friend Ned." I had made up my mind to all. The Canadian left me. I reached the platform, on which I could with difficulty support myself against the shock of the waves. The sky was threatening, but as land was in those thick brown shadows, we must fly. I imagine that fly they mean escape. I returned to the saloon, fearing and yet hoping to see Captain Nemo, wishing and yet not wishing to see him. What could have I said to him? Could I hide the involuntary horror which he inspired me? No. It was better that I should not meet him face to face. Better to forget him. And yet, how long seemed that day, the last day that I should pass in the Nautilus. I remained alone. Ned Land and Conseil avoided speaking, for fear of betraying themselves. At 6 I dined, but I was not hungry. I forced myself to eat in spite of my disgust, that I might not weaken myself. At 6:30, Ned Land came to my room, saying, "We shall not see each other again before our departure. At 10 the moon will not be risen. We will profit by the darkness. Come to the boat. Consul and I will wait for you." The Canadian went out without giving me time to answer. Wishing to verify the course of the Nautilus, I went to the saloon. We were running N&E at frightful speed, and more than 50 yards deep. I cast a last look on those wonders of nature, on the riches of art heaped up in this museum, upon the unrivaled collection destined to perish at the bottom of the sea, with him who had formed it. I wished to fix an indelible impression of it in my mind. I remained an hour thus, bathed in the light of that luminous ceiling, and passing in review those treasures shining under the glasses. Then I returned to my room. I dressed myself in strong sea clothing. I collected my notes, placing them carefully about me. My heart beat loudly. I could not check its pulsations. Certainly my trouble and agitation would have betrayed me to Captain Nemo's eyes. What was he doing? What was he doing at this moment? I listened at the door of his room. I heard steps. Captain Nemo was there. He had not gone to rest. At every moment I expected to see him appear and ask me why I wished to fly. I was constantly on the alert. My imagination magnified everything. The impression became at last so poignant that I asked myself if I would not be better to go to the captain's room, see him face to face, and brave him with look and gesture. It was the inspiration of a madman. Fortunately, I resisted the desire and stretched myself on my bed to quiet my bodily agitation. My nerves were somewhat calmer, but in my excited brain I saw over again all my existence on board the Nautilus. Every incident, either happy or unfortunate, which had happened since my disappearance from the Abraham Lincoln. The submarine straits, the submarine hunt, the Torres Straits, the Savage of Papua, the running ashore, the coral cemetery, the passage of Suez, the island of Santorin, the Cretan River, Virgo Bay, Atlantis, the iceberg, the South Pole, the imprisonment in the ice, the fight among the poops, the storm in the Gulf Stream, the Avenger, and the horrible scene of the vessel sunk with all her crew. All those events passed before my eyes like scenes in a drama. Then Captain Nemo seemed to grow enormously, his features to assume superhuman proportions. He was no longer my equal, but a man of the waters, the genie of the sea. It was then 9:30. I held my head between my hands to keep it from bursting. I closed my eyes. I would not think any longer. There was another half hour to wait, another half hour of a nightmare, which might drive me mad. At that moment I heard the distant strains of the organ, a sad harmony to an undefinable chant, the wail of a soul longing to break these earthly bonds. I listened with every sense, scarcely breathing, plunged like Captain Nemo in that musical ecstasy which was drawing him in spirit to end of life. Then A sudden thought terrified me. Captain Nemo had left his room. He was in the saloon, which I must cross to fly. There I should meet him for the last time. He would see me, perhaps speak to me. A gesture of his might destroy me. A single word chained me on board. But 10 was about to strike. The moment had come for me to leave my room and join my companions. I must not hesitate, even if Captain Nemo himself should rise before me. I opened my door carefully, and even then, as it turned on its hinges, it seemed to me to make a dreadful noise. Perhaps it only existed in my own imagination. I crept along the dark stairs of the Nautilus, stopping at each step to check the beating of my heart. I reached the door of the saloon and opened it gently. It was plunged in profound darkness. The strains of the organ sounded faintly. Captain Nemo was there. He did not see me. In the full light, I do not think he would have noticed me, so entirely he was absorbed in the ecstasy. I crept along the carpet, avoiding the slightest sound which might betray my presence. I was at least 5 minutes reaching the door, as the opposite side, opening into the library. I was going to open it when a sigh from Captain Nemo nailed me on the spot. I knew that he was rising. I could even see him, for the light from the library came through to the saloon. He came towards me silently, with his arms crossed, gliding like a spectre rather than walking. His breast was swelling with sobs, and I heard him murmur these words, the last of which ever struck my ear. Almighty God, enough, enough. Was it a confession of remorse which thus escaped from this man's conscience? In desperation, I rushed through the library, mounted the central staircase, and following the upper flight, reached the boat. I crept through the opening, which had already admitted my 2 companions. Let us go! Let us go! I exclaimed. Directly, replied the Canadian. The orifice in the plates of the Nautilus was first closed and fastened down by means of a false key, which Ned Land had provided himself. An opening of the boat was also closed. The Canadian began to loosen the bolts which still hold us to the submarine boat. Suddenly, a noise within was heard. Voices were answering each other loudly. What was the matter? Had they discovered our flight? I felt Ned Land slipping a dagger into my hand. Yes, I murmured. We know how to die. The Canadian had stopped in his work, but one word, many times repeated, a dreadful word, revealed the cause of the agitation spreading on board the Nautilus. It was not we, the crew, we were looking after. The maelstrom! The maelstrom! I exclaimed. The maelstrom! Could a more dreadful word in a dreadful situation have sounded in our ears? We were then upon the dangerous coast of Norway. Was the Nautilus being drawn into this Goof at the moment our boat was going to leave its sides? We knew that at the tide of the pent-up waters between the islands of the Faroe and Newfoundland rushed with irresistible violence, forming a whirlpool from which no vessel ever escapes. From every point of the horizon, enormous waves were meeting, forming a gulf, justly called the navel of the ocean. whose power of attraction extends to a distance of 12 miles. There, not only vessels, but whales were sacrificed, as well as white bears from the northern regions. It is thither that the Nautilus, voluntarily or involuntarily, had been run by the captain. I was describing a spiral, a circumference of which was lessening by degrees, and the boat, which was still fastened to its side, was carried along with giddy speed. I felt that the sickly giddiness which arises from long continued whirling around. We were in dread. Our horror was at its height. Circulation had stopped, all nervous influence was annihilated, and we were covered with cold sweat, like a sweat of agony. And what noise around our frail bark! What roarings repeated by the echo miles away! What an uproar was that of the waters broken on the sharp rocks of the bottom, where the hardest bodies are crushed and trees worn away, with all the fur rubbed off, according to the Norwegian phrase. What a situation to be in! We rocked frightfully. The Nautilus defended itself like a human being. Its steel muscles cracked. Sometimes it seemed to stand upright, and we with it. "We must hold on," said Ned, "and look after the boats. We may still be saved if we stick to the Nautilus." He had not finished the words when we heard the crashing noise. The boats gave way, and the boat, torn from its groove, was hurled like a stone from a sling into the midst of the whirlpool. My head struck on a piece of iron. With the violent shock, I lost all consciousness. Chapter 23. Conclusion. Thus ends the voyage under the seas. What passed during that night, how the boat escaped from the eddies in the maelstrom, how Ned Land, Conseil, and myself ever came out of the Gulf, I cannot tell. But when I returned to consciousness, I was lying on a fisherman's hut on the Lofoden Isles. My two companions, safe and sound, were near me, holding my hands. We embraced each other heartily. Read Edgar Allan Poe's Descent into the Maelstrom, from which Verne undoubtedly got his idea for his stories finished, a story of underwater life that is even now coming true. At that moment we could not think of returning to France. The means of communication between the north of Norway and the south are rare, and I am therefore obliged to wait for the steamboat running monthly from Cape South. And among the worthy people who have so kindly received us, I revise my record of these adventures once more. Not a fact has been omitted, not a detail exaggerated. It is a faithful narrative of this incredible expedition in an element inaccessible to man, but to which progress will one day open a road. Shall I be believed? I do not know, and it matters little, after all. What I now affirm is that I have a right to speak of these seas, under which, in less than 10 months, I have crossed 20,000 leagues in that submarine tour of the world, which has revealed so many wonders. But what has become of the Nautilus? Did it resist pressure of the maelstrom? Does Captain Nemo still live? And does he still follow under the ocean those frightful retaliations? Or did he stop after that last hecatomb? Will the waves one day carry him, this manuscript containing the history of his life? Shall I ever know the name of this man? Will the missing vessel tell us its nationality, that the Captain Nemo? I hope so, and I also hope that his powerful vessel has conquered the sea at its most terrible gulf, and that of the Nautilus has survived where so many other vessels had been lost. If it be so, if Captain Nemo still inhabits the ocean, his adopted country, may hatred be appeased in that savage heart, may the contemplation of so many wonders extinguish forever the spirit of vengeance, may the judge disappear, and the philosopher continue the peaceful exploration of the sea. If his destiny be strange, it is also sublime. Have I not understood it myself? Have I not lived 10 months of his unnatural life? And to the question asked by Ecclesiastes 3,000 years ago, that which is far off and exceeding deep, who can find it out? 2 men alone, of all now living, have the right to give an answer: Captain Nemo and myself. The end. So we end our tale. I was hoping to get to know more about Captain Nemo. Why did he do all this? What were those people? I was a little disappointed that Aronnax simply tossed it all aside on vengeance. I could at least have tried to ask him what it was all about and try to talk to him. Even though he didn't see him often, I could at least have tried to speak to him. There was just so... But well, so this is it. The grand voyage of Captain Nemo, Aronnax, Conseil, and our quite tormented Ned Land. Let's see what is this information. Greatest voyage of all. Verning Paris. It's telling about the author. Prepare to dive. The story of the submarine. Safe from pirates. A Dutch physician became the next submarine. Yeah, that makes sense, to be safe from pirates. The Nautilus. The Nautilus, a quarter century after the Tortoise attack of the British Navy, American inventor Robert Fulton built a submarine. This was the Nautilus, made of copper plates bent around an iron frame. She was quite an improvement over Bushnell's model and used fins to help rise and descend. More Nautiluses. Nautilus does sound like a bit of a generic name, doesn't it? I think I have seen that name being used for other... The newest Nautilus. It's just possible Captain Nemo was talking about nuclear power when he says, "Professor, my electricity is not the usual kind, but I hope you will permit me to not go into it further." Scientists doubtful that the sodium batteries he described would produce great quantities of power his craft needed. If this was his secret, it has been rediscovered and is now the source of power for the newer US submarines. For nuclear power doesn't use oxygen. On the contrary, there is so much power that what's left over can be used to extract oxygen from seawater. Oh, so that's an upgrade from what he had at the Nautilus. They didn't have the capacity to extract oxygen. Nuclear cargo ships. I didn't know those existed. Nuclear submarines and nuclear cargo ships. And Jules Verne, wherever he may be, is doubtless smiling, knowingly as he smokes his seaweed Havana and murmurs politely, "I told you so 100 years ago." This is a very old book, isn't it? Yeah. You seem very advanced for his time. Bearing oysters. So it looks like we don't have things that are similar to this today. Even more powerful by some measure. That's curious that none of them have the spike at the front that he used in the Nautilus, or does this have Steam David with torpedo mounted on spar? Okay, this is one. It's kinda clever to have a spike. And operate fully submerged. Steam powered. That was 1888. That gives 140 years now since this book was written. Is there a date? Let's see. Is there a date on the beginning? Let the keep. Maybe a date. Research production. This book version is from 1986. 100 years, then I guess this book is from 1868. That's a long time. So there we have it. We complete his journey. I wonder if he wrote any more books on this to complete this. Like some tale of what happened to Captain Nemo. Or rather, they found out the ship that is missing. So next week then I will be reading a different book, I guess, depending on what Lumina gives to me. This one she just brought in one day. I can't quite pick it. I just have to depend on what she brings to me next time. Hopefully something interesting. So well then, bye and have a great night or morning or afternoon to everyone wherever you are. Bye bye. Oh yeah. I always forget. See if there's anyone to raid. Okay, there we go. Mr. Pingo is drawing. I think he's a rather relaxing fellow. That should be relaxing as well.